Have you ever witnessed a moment so powerful it changed everything you believed about music? Bob Marley was about to prove that sometimes the most profound music doesn't come from instruments at all. It comes from something deeper, something that connects every human heart in ways we can barely comprehend. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most incredible moments, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell because we uncover the hidden gems that shaped the legends we know today. July 21st, 1979, Madison Square Garden, New York City. The most famous arena in the world was packed with 50,000 people who had come to witness something special. Bob Marley and the Wailers were performing what many considered to be one of the greatest concerts in reggae history. But none of them knew they were about to experience something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The energy in the garden was electric. Bob had already performed Get Up, Stand Up, No Woman, No Cry, and I Shot the Sheriff. The crowd was in ecstasy, singing along to every word, swaying to every rhythm. This wasn't just a concert. This was a spiritual gathering, a communion between an artist and his people. At 10:47 p.m., Bob walked to center stage. The arena lights dimmed until only a single spotlight illuminated him. He cradled his acoustic guitar, the same battered instrument that had been his companion for over a decade. The crowd knew what was coming. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Redemption Song. Bob's fingers found the opening chords. The melody began to fill the massive space. His voice started the first verse. Old pirates, yes, they rob I. 50,000 voices held their breath. Redemption Song wasn't just a song. It was a prayer, a battle cry, a reminder that freedom starts in the mind. Sold I to the merchant ships. As he reached for the high note, disaster struck. Snap. The high E string broke like a gunshot. Music died instantly. 50,000 people went from euphoria to confusion. Bob looked down at his guitar. The broken string hung limply. For a moment that felt like eternity. Bob Marley stood in complete silence. The crowd murmured. Some thought this was part of the show. Others worried something was wrong. In the front row, Sarah noticed Bob wasn't upset. He was thinking. What happened next, nobody saw coming. Not the band, not the crew, not the 50,000 people watching. Not even Bob himself knew he was about to create the most powerful musical moment of his career. Instead of calling for another guitar, instead of having the string replaced, instead of moving on to another song, Bob did something that defied every rule of live performance. He set his guitar down. Gently, reverently, he placed the instrument on its stand and walked back to the microphone. The arena was dead silent now. You could hear a pin drop from the back row. Bob leaned into the microphone, his voice soft, but carrying to every corner of Madison Square Garden. Sometimes, he said, the music breaks. Sometimes the instruments fail us. But you know what never breaks? He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, all hanging on his every word. The music in your hearts. The music in your souls. That music is unbreakable. What Bob did next has become the stuff of legend. Standing alone on stage with no guitar, no backing band, no instruments at all, he began to sing Redemption Song a cappella. Old pirates, yes, they rob I. His voice, naked and vulnerable, filled the enormous space. Without the guitar to lean on, without the safety net of instrumentation, Bob's voice became pure spirit, pure emotion, pure truth. Sold I to the merchant ships. And then something magical happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a single voice joined him, then another, then 10, then 100. Minutes after they took I from the bottomless pit. By the time Bob reached the chorus, 50,000 people were singing with him. Not singing along, singing with him. Their voices blended into something that transcended music, transcended performance, transcended everything any of them had ever experienced. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. The sound was overwhelming, not in volume, but in spirit. 50,000 individual voices becoming one voice, one message, one truth. None but ourselves can free our minds. Sarah, the girl in the front row, later said that she looked around and saw something she had never seen before. Strangers were holding hands. People were crying openly. Tough-looking men had tears streaming down their faces. Well-dressed women were swaying with construction workers. Black and white, young and old, rich and poor. All boundaries dissolved in that moment. As the song progressed, something impossible happened. 50,000 voices began to harmonize organically, naturally, as if guided by an invisible conductor. Soprano voices found their place above the melody. Tenor voices filled the middle. Bass voices provided foundation. Without direction or training, 50,000 strangers created the most beautiful version of redemption song ever performed. Bob stood in the center of it all, no longer leading but participating. His voice was no longer the dominant sound, but part of a collective instrument made of human hearts and souls. Have no fear for atomic energy. The song began to take on new life, new meaning. In that moment, Bob's message of mental emancipation wasn't just being sung, it was being lived. These people were freeing themselves from the mental slavery that told them they couldn't make beautiful music, that they weren't good enough, that they were separate from each other. None but ourselves can free our minds. As the final chorus began, something happened that stopped even Bob's legendary composure. He started crying on stage. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a moved artist. Bob Marley, the prophet of reggae, the voice of the oppressed, the man who had faced assassination attempts and persecution with unshakable strength, broke down and sobbed. Later, in interviews, Bob would say that in that moment, he finally understood what his music was really for. It wasn't to make him famous. It wasn't to spread Rastafarian beliefs. It wasn't even to fight injustice, though all of those things mattered. It was to prove that human beings, at their core, are connected by something unbreakable. That when we strip away the instruments, the technology, the barriers we build between ourselves and others, what remains is pure love, pure unity, pure music. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. As the song reached its climax, something happened that the sound engineers still can't explain. The individual voices began to phase in and out, creating natural reverb and echo effects that sounded like they were being produced by expensive studio equipment. But there was no equipment. There was no enhancement. There was just 50,000 people singing together so perfectly that they created their own acoustic magic. None but ourselves can free our minds. When the last note faded away, something unprecedented happened at Madison Square Garden. For nearly 2 full minutes, 50,000 people stood in absolute silence. Not the silence of confusion or disappointment. The silence of awe. The silence of people who had just experienced something that couldn't be explained, only felt. The silence of souls that had been touched by the divine. Bob stood at the microphone, tears still flowing, looking out at the faces of people who had just shared something with him that went beyond entertainment, beyond performance, beyond anything that could be contained in the business of music. Finally, he spoke. You see? You see what we just did? We took a broken moment and made it whole. We took silence and filled it with love. We took separation and created unity. That is the power of music. Not the instruments, not the technology, not the industry. You, all of you, we are the music. The applause that followed wasn't applause. It was something else entirely. It was the sound of 50,000 people acknowledging that they had just been part of a miracle. The legend grows. Word spread quickly. Bootleg recordings circulated, but they couldn't capture what really happened. The feeling of 50,000 strangers becoming family, barriers dissolving into pure connection. Musicians who heard about that night began experimenting with their own stripped-down performances. The unplugged movement that would define the 1990s can trace its roots directly back to that broken guitar string in Madison Square Garden. But more importantly, the thousands of people who were there that night carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Many said it changed their perspective on music, on humanity, on what's possible when we come together despite our differences. The testimonies. Sarah became a music therapist. I saw 50,000 strangers become a choir without a conductor. It shaped everything I believe about music's healing power. Michael Rodriguez became a community organizer. I saw unity happen. I felt it. If 50,000 different people could create something that beautiful together, anything was possible. Dr. James Washington, who was doing his medical residency at the time and had scored tickets as a gift from his girlfriend, changed his specialization to music therapy for trauma victims. That night taught me that healing doesn't always come from medicine, he explained. Sometimes it comes from connection, from shared experience, from the recognition that we're not alone in this world. The secret Bob never told. But there's something about that night that Bob never revealed publicly, something that he shared only with his closest family and friends. The guitar string didn't break by accident. Earlier that day, during sound check, Bob had noticed that the high E string was worn and likely to break. Any guitar technician would have replaced it immediately. But Bob told them to leave it alone. "Why would you do that?" his guitar tech asked. "It could break right in the middle of the show." Bob's response, according to Rita Marley, was prophetic. "Sometimes we need things to break. Sometimes the breaking is where the magic happens. Sometimes we need to lose the music to find the music." Bob had spent weeks thinking about that broken string, wondering if he should tell people the truth. But he decided that it didn't matter whether the string broke by accident or by design. What mattered was what everyone, including Bob himself, had done in response to that moment of crisis. The ripple effect. The impact of that night continued to spread in ways no one could have predicted. Community choirs started forming in cities where people had been at the concert. A cappella groups began dedicating their performances to the spirit of Madison Square Garden. Music venues started hosting broken instrument nights, where performers would deliberately disable parts of their equipment to create moments of vulnerability and connection with their audiences. The phrase, "finding the music in the silence," became a common expression in artistic communities, referring to moments when technical failures or limitations force artists to discover new depths in their creativity. But perhaps the most profound impact was on how people understood the relationship between performer and audience. That night proved that the boundaries between artist and listener, between stage and crowd, between creator and consumer, are artificial. Music isn't something that flows from performer to audience. Music is something that emerges from the connection between human hearts. It exists in the space between people, not in the instruments they play or the words they sing. Bob Marley knew this intuitively, but that night at Madison Square Garden, he proved it to the world. 3 years later, when Bob was dying of cancer, he often spoke about that night to his family. According to Ziggy Marley, his father considered it the most important performance of his career. Not because of the music, Ziggy explained, but because of what it taught him about people. He always believed that music could unite us, but that night he saw it happen. He witnessed the proof that love and unity aren't just ideas. They're forces that can be activated when we have the courage to be vulnerable together. When Bob died in 1981, among the thousands of tributes that poured in from around the world, one stood out. It was a letter signed by 200 people who had been at Madison Square Garden that night. "Thank you," the letter said, "for showing us that the most powerful music doesn't come from instruments. It comes from hearts that are brave enough to sing together, even when, especially when, the world seems broken." Today, more than 40 years later, music historians still study what happened that night. Acoustic engineers have tried to recreate the natural reverb effects that 50,000 voices produced. Sociologists have analyzed how strangers can coordinate so perfectly without direction. But the real legacy of that broken guitar string isn't academic. It's personal. It lives in the hearts of everyone who was there, and everyone who has heard the story and been inspired to believe that human connection is possible even in our divided world. When someone asks you what Bob Marley's greatest song was, you might think of No Woman, No Cry or One Love or Three Little Birds. But anyone who was at Madison Square Garden on July 21st, 1979 will tell you. His greatest song was the one he didn't sing alone. That broken guitar string didn't end the music. It set the music free. And somewhere, in the spaces between our words, in the pauses between our breaths, in the silence that connects one heartbeat to the next, that music is still playing. All we have to do is listen. All we have to do is sing. All we have to do is remember that we are all part of the same song.